we begin by sliding down the silk-draped corridors of medieval Korean wealth. Between your warm blankets and the history I'm about to whisper, you're about to encounter luxury so refined you probably won't survive the first dynasty without bankrupting yourself trying to afford a single celadon vase. So before you drift off completely, like this video and subscribe, only if this kind of sleepy narration is your thing. Now kill the overhead lights, maybe light a candle, and let's get into some history. Welcome. The year is 918 CE, and a military commander named Wang Jin has just declared himself King Tijo, founding the Goryeo dynasty atop the ruins of the crumbling unified Silla kingdom. You're standing at the birth of what would become one of Korea's most culturally sophisticated and materially opulent periods, a time when the definition of wealth would be refined to an art form that would influence East Asian aristocratic tastes for centuries. This nascent kingdom, being rich, isn't just about having more barley in your storehouse than your neighbor. It's an intricate code of aesthetic and cultural markers, carefully cultivated connections, and the subtle display of things that, by their very existence, suggest you don't need to work with your hands. The truly wealthy in early Goryeo are largely holdovers from the aristocratic families of the late Silla period, those who managed to position themselves advantageously during the transition of power. Imagine walking through the northern capital of Goryeo, modern-day Kaesong, in those early decades. The streets are a choreography of status indicators. You can immediately identify the wealthy by their flowing silk robes with wide sleeves, impossibly impractical for manual labor, and therefore a walking billboard that says, "I don't need to do anything but exist elegantly." Their hands are soft, their skin unmarked by the sun, their nails conspicuously long. These physical features aren't accidental. They're deliberately cultivated statements about not having to labor outdoors. But the most significant wealth markers of early Goryeo are far more subtle than clothing or physical appearance. The truly rich are distinguished by what they know and who they know. Classical Chinese literary education becomes the bedrock of elite identity, with the sons of aristocratic families devoting decades to memorizing Confucian classics and mastering the art of poetry composition in literary Chinese, a language that bears about as much resemblance to spoken Korean as Latin does to modern English. Speaking of language, you might notice something peculiar about the manner in which elites communicate. They frequently drop literary allusions in casual conversation, like little intellectual landmines, casually referencing obscure Chinese philosophical texts in ways that immediately identify fellow members of the educated class, while simultaneously exposing the ignorance of social climbers. It's a kind of linguistic password system. If you recognize the reference to the spring and autumn annals I just casually mentioned, you might belong here. If not, well, perhaps you should return to whatever farm you crawled from. Buddhism, imported centuries earlier from China, flowers during early Goryeo into an institution of immense wealth and political influence. The aristocracy doesn't just practice Buddhism, they financially sponsor it on a scale that transforms the religion into a glittering showcase for elite patronage. When you're truly wealthy in Goryeo, You don't just pray at temples, you build them, endow them with lands and servants, commission elaborate sutras written in gold, and ensure your family name is prominently displayed as the benefactor. The most famous luxury products of the early Goryeo period, items that would define Korean craftsmanship for centuries, are those distinctive celadon ceramics with their pale blue-green glaze that makes them look as if they've been carved from jade and then somehow made translucent. These aren't just pottery, they're technological marvels that require specialized kilns, rare minerals, and artisans with skills developed over generations. Owning fine celadon places you in a tiny minority of Koreans who can afford objects of no practical value whatsoever beyond their ability to silently announce your exceptional taste and disposable income. The rich of early Goryeo are also defined by what they eat, specifically rice, while the common folk survive primarily on millet, barley, and various foraged greens. The aristocracy dines almost exclusively on white rice, a crop so labor-intensive and inefficient that using it as your primary food source is essentially burning money at every meal. And it's not just rice, but the rare spices imported along the Silk Road, the specialized cooking techniques that require dedicated kitchen staff, and the elaborate presentation vessels that transform eating from sustenance into ceremony. As for your living arrangements, if you're among the Goryeo elite, your home is likely constructed around principles adapted from Chinese geomancy, positioned to maximize auspicious energy flows while showcasing imported luxuries. Your floors are heated through an ingenious underfloor system called ondol, a technology that predates similar European innovations by centuries. Your walls might feature painted silk screens depicting classic Chinese landscapes or literary themes, visual evidence of your cultural literacy and continental connections. Let's not forget the most ostentatious wealth markers of all people. The truly wealthy in Goryeo own people, not just servants, but scores of household slaves who constitute a significant portion of the kingdom's population. These unfortunate souls, war captives, criminals, or those who sold themselves into servitude to escape starvation, form the invisible infrastructure that allows the aristocracy to maintain their immaculate appearance of effortless refinement. By the mid-Goryeo period, around the 11th century, the kingdom has developed sophisticated trade networks reaching as far as the Islamic world. Merchants from Central Asia bring luxuries previously unknown, new fabrics, spices, and techniques that the Goryeo elite quickly incorporate into their repertoire of status markers. Some wealthy families begin collecting foreign curiosities, artifacts from distant lands, whose primary value lies in their exotic unfamiliarity. But being rich in Goryeo isn't simply accumulating expensive things. It's about cultivating an aesthetic sensibility that balances Confucian principles of moderation with unmistakable markers of privilege. The ideal wealthy person exhibits a kind of studied casualness toward their own abundance, appearing neither too eager about material goods, vulgar, nor too ascetic, suspiciously pious. It's a delicate performance, requiring generations of wealth to perfect, which is precisely the point. As the Goryeo period progresses through repeated Mongol invasions in the 13th century, wealth becomes increasingly militarized. The aristocracy begins investing in private armies, fortified estates, and strategic marriages to Mongol elites. Being rich now means having enough resources to protect what you have, or at least enough savvy to collaborate with the right conquerors at the right moment. What's fascinating about wealth in Goryeo is how it gradually evolves from pure hereditary aristocracy towards something that, at least theoretically, could be achieved through scholarship. The civil service examination system, modeled after the Chinese imperial examinations, creates a pathway, albeit a narrow one, for talented young men from less elite backgrounds to enter government service and potentially accumulate wealth and status through official positions. This shift doesn't democratize wealth exactly, but it does introduce a meritocratic element that would become increasingly important in the later Joseon period. By the late Goryeo, being rich increasingly means having the resources to educate your sons to a standard where they can compete in these brutally difficult examinations. Tests so comprehensive they required years of dedicated study and mastery of literary Chinese composition styles that bore no resemblance to everyday Korean communication. And the early dawn of Joseon, something remarkable happens to the concept of wealth. The Yongbin, that uniquely Korean aristocratic class, doesn't just emerge, it crystallizes like a particularly obstinate mineral formation in the bedrock of Korean society. You're witnessing the birth of one of history's most elaborate class structures, one where wealth and power become inextricably linked to education and bureaucratic service. The term Yongbin literally means two orders, referring to the civilian and military officials who constitute the governing elite. But don't let that deceptively simple translation fool you. Becoming Yongbin is about as straightforward as teaching your pet goldfish to recite Confucian classics while performing synchronized swimming routines. It's a status simultaneously inherited and achieved, a paradox that would define Korean social structure for half a millennium. Picture yourself as an ambitious young man in the transitional period between Goryeo and Joseon around the late 14th century. Your family has some land, some education, and connections to the right people. Your path to Yongbin status runs straight through the Goryeo, the civil service examination system that resembles a literal academic Hunger Games. You'll spend your childhood and youth memorizing the 4 books and 5 classics of Confucianism, practicing calligraphy until your fingers cramp, and composing elegant 8-legged essays on abstract philosophical concepts that have precisely nothing to do with the actual governance challenges you might face. Oh, and you'll be competing against thousands of other young men, many of whom have been preparing since they could hold a brush. Some families maintain dedicated study compounds where their sons do nothing but prepare for these examinations. The odds of passing, somewhere between astronomical and you're adorably optimistic. In some years, literally hundreds of candidates competed for a single open position. Imagine spending 20 years studying for a test with a 0.5% pass rate, and you'll understand why Yongbin wealth wasn't something you could simply purchase with sufficient coin. Let's say you somehow pass this intellectual gauntlet. Congratulations. You've earned an entry-level position in the government bureaucracy with a salary that's frankly insufficient to maintain the lifestyle expected of someone of your new status. This is where the true alchemy of Yongbin wealth begins, because the real money isn't in your official stipend, but in the extraordinary network of patronage, gift-giving, and influence peddling that accompanies your position as a government official. You'll receive gifts from those seeking your favor, collect fees for expediting bureaucratic processes, and use your insider knowledge to ensure your family's lands are situated to benefit from government projects. None of this is exactly legal, but it's so thoroughly normalized that the distinction becomes meaningless. The system isn't corrupt, corruption is the system. But perhaps the most brilliant aspect of Yongbin wealth is how it perpetuates itself. Your newly acquired status provides your children with advantages that make it far more likely they'll pass the examinations themselves, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of privilege disguised as meritocracy. You can afford tutors, books, and leisure time for study. Your connections provide insider information about examination topics. Your family name opens doors closed to others with equal talent but lesser pedigrees. What makes this system particularly remarkable is how it transforms wealth from a simple accumulation of material goods into something far more abstract, cultural capital. The Yongbin are rich not just in land or money, but in knowledge, connections, and prestige. This is wealth you can't easily steal or tax. It exists in the minds of the elite and in their complex web of relationships. This isn't to suggest Yongbin don't enjoy material luxuries. They absolutely do. But what distinguishes them is that their consumption is carefully calibrated to display refinement rather than mere abundance. The nouveau rich merchant might wear garish silks and flash gold, but the Yongbin aristocrat signals his status through the subtle quality of his simple white robes, the literary allusions in his conversation, and the antiquities thoughtfully displayed in his reception room. One particularly fascinating aspect of Yongbin wealth is how it systematically devalues commerce. In theory, the social hierarchy of Joseon places scholars at the top, followed by farmers, artisans, and merchants at the bottom, a ranking system borrowed from Chinese Confucianism. In practice, wealthy merchants might have more actual cash than many Yongbin families, but they remain socially inferior. Money without cultural refinement is considered vulgar, almost obscene, like watching someone eat cake with their hands at a royal banquet. This creates the somewhat absurd situation where some Yongbin families might be technically poorer than successful merchants, but would rather starve in genteel poverty than engage in trade. They're literally rich in everything except money, surviving on increasingly subdivided inherited lands while maintaining elaborate facades of aristocratic leisure. Some Yongbin families become what we might call threadbare aristocrats, their robes fraying at the edges, their ancestral homes in need of repair, but their status intact as long as they maintain their distance from anything resembling honest commercial work. Not that Yongbin wealth is entirely divorced from economic reality. Land remains the foundation of aristocratic fortune, with most Yongbin families deriving their income from tenant farmers working their hereditary estates. A complex system of tenant farming emerges where peasants typically surrender half their harvest to the landlord, an arrangement that allows Yongbin to maintain their scholarly pursuits without dirtying their hands with actual agricultural labor. This land-based wealth becomes increasingly concentrated over the Joseon period. By the 16th century, an estimated 70% of agricultural land is controlled by Yongbin families, creating an extraordinary concentration of wealth among roughly 10% of the population. This concentration is further amplified by the fact that Yongbin are largely exempt from taxes and military service privileges that effectively transfer wealth from the productive classes to the scholarly elite. The social boundaries around Yongbin status are zealously guarded through family registers that meticulously document genealogy. Marriage becomes a carefully regulated transaction designed to preserve both bloodlines and wealth. Yongbin families arrange marriages with other families of similar status, creating complex webs of kinship that double as political alliances and economic partnerships. These marriage networks become so intricate that by the mid-Joseon period, most prominent Yongbin families can trace connections to each other through marriage, a situation that makes the European aristocracy look positively egalitarian by comparison. Perhaps the most peculiar aspect of Yongbin wealth is its relationship with power. Unlike European nobility, Yongbin status doesn't automatically confer political authority. You need to secure a government position through the examination system. Yet, status and political power are so thoroughly intertwined that they're effectively two sides of the same coin. This creates fascinating situations where politically sidelined Yongbin families might maintain their social standing while having little actual influence, while newly risen families might have power but find themselves socially ostracized despite their wealth. The stability of this system is remarkable, persisting with only minor modifications from the 14th to the 19th century. What makes it so durable is how thoroughly it integrates economic, social, political, and cultural forms of capital. To be truly wealthy in Joseon means possessing all these forms simultaneously, a feat so difficult that social mobility effectively freezes for centuries. At the late Joseon period, the Yongbin class expands beyond its original narrow definition, as some wealthy non-Yongbin families find ways to purchase or forge genealogical records. This practice, called buying the bones, involves adopting the family name and ancestry of declining Yongbin lineages, essentially purchasing social status. The practice is widely condemned, but increasingly common, creating a shadow economy of social mobility that undermines the theoretical rigidity of the status system. In 16th century Seoul, or Hanyang, as it was known then, you've managed to secure an invitation that most commoners would never receive in their lifetimes, and you're about to witness domestic opulence that exists behind carefully constructed walls of privacy and exclusion. The first thing you notice about elite housing isn't some towering palace. That's a Western misconception. It's the walls, high, substantial walls that completely shield the compound from public view. This isn't merely for security. It's about creating invisible zones where wealth can express itself without the vulgar gaze of the masses. Privacy itself becomes a luxury that only the wealthy can afford, a physical manifestation of social distance. As you pass through the main gate, a structure so significant it has its own tile roof and carved wooden details, you immediately understand that Korean aristocratic architecture operates on principles entirely different from Western counterparts. Where European wealth might express itself through vertical grandeur, think Gothic spires and towering shadows, Yongbin wealth spreads horizontally, consuming vast quantities of prime urban real estate. The message is clear. We have so much land that we can afford to use it inefficiently. The layout follows strict Confucian principles of gender segregation and social hierarchy. The Anringki, or outer quarters, houses the public-facing spaces, and the Sarangbang, the master's study, where he receives male visitors. This room is the intellectual heart of Yongbin wealth, a space so carefully curated it makes modern influencers look like amateur decorators. Each object, the brush stand, the books, the strategically placed antique, communicates the owner's refined taste and scholarly accomplishments. Meanwhile, in the inner sanctum behind another gate, you'll find the Anki, the women's quarters, where the female members of the household live in luxurious seclusion. These spaces are off-limits to male visitors outside the family, creating a domain that operates under its own rules and hierarchies. Here, wealth expresses itself differently through exquisite embroidery, lacquerware, and the fine craftsmanship of domestic objects that only other elite women would ever see. The architecture itself embodies subtle wealth signals through seemingly humble materials used with exceptional craftsmanship. The wooden pillars supporting the structure aren't painted or gilded. They're simply the highest quality timber, carefully selected for grain pattern and durability. The paper windows aren't adorned with gaudy decoration. They're made from the finest mulberry paper that perfectly diffuses light. This is wealth that pretends not to be wealth, that disguises itself as simplicity while requiring extraordinary resources to achieve. Let's talk about floors for a moment. You're walking on heated floors, the famous Andal system that circulates hot air from kitchen fires through channels beneath stone floors covered with layers of paper and oil-treated paper. This radiant heating technology, perfected centuries before similar systems appeared in Europe, transforms the interior climate of wealthy homes. While commoners might huddle around a single fire, wealthy families enjoy consistent warmth throughout their sprawling compounds, a luxury so fundamental it shapes everything from furniture design, low tables, and floor cushions, to social customs. The quality of construction becomes a wealth signal in itself. Notice the perfectly fitted wooden joinery that uses no nails, only precisely cut wooden pegs, and ingenious interlocking designs. This level of craftsmanship requires master carpenters whose skills have been honed through decades of training. The wealthy don't just pay for materials, they pay for generations of accumulated expertise, embodied in every joint and beam. As you explore further, you discover that the compound contains not just living quarters, but specialized buildings for every conceivable function: separate kitchens, storehouses, quarters for servants and slaves, guest houses, and even private family shrines where ancestors are venerated with elaborate rituals. This architectural segregation of functions is itself a luxury that communicates just how much space the family can afford to waste. Water features prominently in elite residences, while commoners must fetch water from public wells. Wealthy compounds often contain private wells or elaborate systems for collecting rainwater. Some even feature decorative ponds or carefully positioned stone water basins that serve both practical and aesthetic functions. The sound of water burbling from a bamboo pipe into a stone basin becomes part of the sensory landscape of wealth, a constant ambient reminder of abundance in a society where water access is otherwise labor-intensive. Gardens are where Yongbin wealth perhaps expresses itself most philosophically. Unlike the geometric formal gardens of European aristocracy, Korean elite gardens aim to create idealized natural landscapes in miniature, the articulation of the Confucian and Taoist ideal of harmony with nature. These aren't gardens for growing food, but for growing ideas, spaces for contemplation, where carefully positioned rocks, trees, and water features create scenes worthy of classical Chinese landscape paintings. The relationship between these architectural elements and wealth is subtle but profound. The wealthy family doesn't just buy these spaces, they inherit and gradually perfect them over generations. The most prestigious homes are often centuries old, with buildings periodically rebuilt using the same footprint and design, creating a physical continuity that mirrors the family's lineage. When a wealthy Yongbin states that his family has lived here for 15 generations, he's not just boasting about longevity, but about sustained prosperity and social position. Furnishings within these spaces tell their own story of refined consumption. The apparent simplicity of traditional Korean furniture, low tables, cushions rather than chairs, minimalist storage chests, disguises extraordinary craftsmanship. A seemingly simple wooden chest might be constructed from rare, fragrant woods with perfectly matched grain patterns, reinforced with custom-forged metalwork and intricate butterfly joinings, invisible from the exterior. The most valuable pieces aren't necessarily the most ornate, but those made from the finest materials with the most sophisticated techniques. Books occupy a special place in Yongbin households. Private libraries, often housed in dedicated buildings, represent multi-generational investments in intellectual capital. Many contain hand-copied manuscripts or early printed works using movable metal type, a technology Korea pioneered decades before Gutenberg. Some Yongbin libraries are so extensive they rival institutional collections, with rare texts carefully preserved in specialized storage cabinets designed to protect against humidity, insects, and fire. Speaking of fire, it represents both necessity and existential threat to these wooden structures. Wealthy households develop elaborate protocols for fire prevention, with dedicated servants responsible for monitoring kitchen fires and heating systems. Some compounds feature specially constructed fire-resistant storehouses with thick clay walls for protecting the family's most valuable possessions and documents, a physical embodiment of risk management available only to the wealthy. The soundscape of these elite residences differs markedly from common dwellings. The substantial construction and spacious layout create an acoustic environment characterized by tranquility, distance from street noise, muffled footsteps on paper-covered floors, the gentle sliding of wooden doors rather than hinged banging. This acoustic luxury, the ability to control your sonic environment, represents a form of wealth rarely acknowledged, but keenly felt by anyone who has lived without it. Light becomes another element manipulated by architectural wealth. The paper windows of traditional Korean architecture create a distinctive luminous quality, diffuse, shadowless illumination that bathes interiors in gentle radiance. Wealthy households maximize this effect through carefully positioned windows and sometimes double-layered paper treatments that create micro-controlled lighting environments. At night, oil lamps with specially formulated wicks provide steady, smoke-reduced illumination, a luxury compared to the rudimentary lighting available to commoners. Perhaps most telling is what these spaces lack: obvious displays of ostentatious wealth. You won't find gold leaf, mirrored halls, or rooms dedicated to displaying collections of valuables. The elite Korean interior eschews obvious opulence in favor of restrained elegance that rewards the knowledgeable observer. This isn't wealth minimalism, it's wealth that requires cultural literacy to fully comprehend a form of social capital that can't be purchased outright, but must be absorbed through generational belonging. In traditional Korea, you're about to discover how elite Koreans transformed their physical forms into financial statements, turning silk threads and jade accessories into unmistakable declarations of their socio-economic position. Clothing in pre-modern Korea wasn't just something you threw on to avoid arrest for public nudity. It was a highly regulated semiotic system where every thread spoke volumes about who you were, and more importantly, who you weren't allowed to pretend to be. The sumptuary laws of both Goryeo and Joseon periods controlled who could wear what with an obsessive meticulousness that would make modern fashion police look positively libertarian. Let's start with fabric. If you're wealthy in traditional Korea, you're not wearing scratchy hemp cloth like some common farmer. Your skin touches only the finest silks, not just any silks, but specific varieties with particular weaves and finishes that communicate precise gradations of status. The most prestigious is a gossamer thin silk called sa or gasa, so delicate it seems to float around the body like morning mist. It's completely impractical for anything resembling actual work, which is precisely the point. Your clothes loudly proclaim, "I have never picked up anything heavier than a calligraphy brush, and I intend to keep it that way." The colors of your garments speak just as loudly as their materials. In early Goryeo, vivid purples and reds derived from rare imported dyes might signal wealth, but by Joseon times, the truly elite often opt for pristine white, a color so impractical it requires constant laundering and replacement. Imagine wearing white in a pre-modern world of dirt roads, wood fires, and ink brushes. Keeping white clothes truly white requires an army of servants and a constant supply of fresh garments, a maintenance cost that transforms simple clothing into a ruinous expense only the truly wealthy can sustain. For women of elite households, the outer wrapper skirt chima might contain enough fabric to clothe an entire family of commoners. The voluminous silhouette created by these garments isn't just a fashion choice, it's a physical manifestation of material excess, a way of occupying space that literally pushes others aside to make room for your prosperously expanded outline. Men's hats deserve special attention in our catalog of elite bodily adornment. The distinctive black horsehair hats worn by Yongbin scholars aren't merely head coverings, they're architectural statements perched atop human bodies. The material, shape, and exact dimensions of these hats are precisely calibrated to communicate official rank. Some styles are so impractical, they require complete stillness to remain properly positioned, a physical constraint that reinforces the wearer's removal from manual labor. Imagine trying to harvest rice while balancing what amounts to a delicate black sculpture on your head. It simply can't be done, which is exactly why it signals status so effectively. What's particularly fascinating about these elite garments is how they physically restrict movement. Wide sleeves, long hems, and multiple layers create a body that can only move with deliberate slowness, a kind of built-in behavioral modifier that produces the measured gait and restricted gestures associated with Yongbin dignity. This isn't just cultural performance, it's physically enforced by clothing design. You literally cannot run in properly worn traditional elite hanbok. The wealthy body moves differently because it has been architecturally redesigned through clothing to prioritize dignity over efficiency. Accessories elevate this sartorial language to new heights of status signaling. The jade belt worn by high-ranking officials isn't just decorative, it's an authorized emblem of rank granted by royal authority. Similarly, the thumb rings, embroidered rank badges, and hat finials worn by officials aren't fashion choices, but licensed indicators of precise bureaucratic position. Wearing them without authorization isn't just tacky, it's a crime potentially punishable by death. For elite women, hairpins made from precious metals, coral, jade, or tortoiseshell transform simple hairstyles into investments visible from across a courtyard. These aren't merely pretty trinkets, but portable wealth that combines decorative function with material value, the pre-modern equivalent of wearing your stock portfolio on your head. The conspicuous consumption extends beyond clothing to personal accessories. The writing set carried by Yongbin men, consisting of brushes, inkstone, water dropper, and paper, represents both practical tools and status indicators. The finest examples feature rare materials like jade inkstones, gold inlaid brush handles, or water droppers carved from precious stones. These aren't just implements for writing, they're portable declarations of cultural and material capital. Even the humble fan becomes a wealth indicator in elite hands. While commoners might use crude paper or straw fans for cooling, the aristocratic fan is a marvel of craftsmanship. Sandalwood or ivory sticks supporting painted paper or silk panels, often featuring calligraphy or landscapes by renowned artists. The way these fans are used becomes its own physical language, with different opening angles and handling techniques forming a subtle choreography of class distinction. Interestingly, cosmetics and body modifications play relatively minor roles in traditional Korean wealth display compared to other cultures. The ideal aristocratic face isn't adorned with heavy makeup, but presents a clean, unpainted visage, again, embracing that paradoxical luxury of maintained plainness. The exception might be for elite women, who sometimes use light applications of safflower or other plant-based colorants for subtle lip tinting, products so expensive and perishable they represent a constant drain on resources that only the wealthy can sustain. The elite body odor, yes, we're talking about smell now, even becomes a class marker. The wealthy don't reek of sweat and labor, but may carry the subtle fragrance of incense-stored clothing or sachets of expensive aromatics tucked into layers of garments. Some aristocratic women use perfumed oils in their elaborate hairstyles, creating a literal aura of scented wealth that announces their presence even before they're seen. Bodily comportment, how one stands, sits, walks, and gestures, becomes perhaps the most significant physical manifestation of wealth. The Yangban body moves with deliberate restraint, avoiding expansive gestures or hurried movements that might suggest urgency or worse, physical labor. This cultivated stillness represents generations of training in proper elite behavior, a physical discipline that can't be purchased but must be absorbed through lifetime immersion in aristocratic environments. What's particularly fascinating is how these bodily wealth markers create a feedback loop, reinforcing class boundaries. The pale, unblemished skin prized among the elite isn't just an aesthetic preference, it's physical evidence of indoor scholarly pursuits and freedom from agricultural labor. Similarly, the soft hands with long fingernails displayed by Yangban men physically cannot perform manual work. These aren't just status symbols, they're physical adaptations to privileged lifestyles that make crossing class boundaries not just socially, but physically challenging. Let's not forget one crucial aspect of the wealthy body, its relative cleanliness. While modern historians have sometimes exaggerated the filthiness of pre-modern life, there remains a significant gap between elite and common hygiene practices. Wealthy households maintain dedicated bathing facilities, use finer soaps, and change garments with much greater frequency. The result is a body that literally smells different, free from the persistent odors of physical labor and restricted bathing that characterized commoner existence. By the late Joseon period, we see fascinating changes in these embodied wealth displays as strict sumptuary laws begin to erode and merchants accumulate greater wealth. The exclusive connection between appearance and actual status weakens. Nouveau rich merchants begin adopting elements of Yangban appearance, creating anxiety among traditional elites who respond by developing ever more subtle markers of authentic status that can't be easily imitated. The result is an arms race of increasingly recondite wealth signifiers, not unlike how modern luxury brands constantly evolve to stay ahead of counterfeiters. One particularly amusing development is the emergence of what we might call stealth wealth among some traditional Yangban families. As merchant wealth becomes increasingly ostentatious, some old aristocratic lineages adopt deliberately modest appearance, a kind of conspicuous non-consumption that paradoxically becomes its own status marker. the ability to avoid obvious displays of wealth because your status is so secure you don't need to advertise it becomes the ultimate luxury, a phenomenon not entirely unlike certain ultra-wealthy modern tech executives who signal their status through deliberately casual attire. And prepare ourselves for the most delicious manifestation of Korean wealth, the elite dining table. Nowhere is the gap between rich and poor more viscerally evident than in what, how, and with whom you eat. You're about to discover how feasting becomes a political act, and hunger itself a carefully manufactured aesthetic experience reserved for those who've never actually experienced it. For most Koreans throughout history, eating means consuming just enough barley, millet, or occasionally rice to sustain another day of labor, supplemented with whatever vegetables, foraged plants, or fermented preserves might be available. The peasant meal is fundamentally functional caloric input for physical output, but for the wealthy, eating transcends mere nutrition to become an elaborate performance of abundance, a multisensory theater where food is merely one element in a complex social production. Let's start with rice, that seemingly simple grain that forms the foundation of Korean cuisine. For commoners, white rice is a rare luxury, often reserved for special occasions or mixed with other grains to stretch its use. But in wealthy households, pure white rice is standard daily fare. The process required to transform rice from its natural brown state to gleaming white grains involves substantial labor and material loss, pounding, winnowing, and polishing that removes the most nutritious parts of the grain while creating a visually pure product. This nutritional paradox, the wealthy literally paying more for less nourishing food, demonstrates how status concerns can completely override biological needs. The aristocratic meal is defined not by a single dish, but by its overwhelming multiplicity. The wealthy Korean table features numerous small dishes, banchan, surrounding the central grain, while commoners might make do with a single side dish of kimchi. Elite meals might feature dozens of banchan, a material expression of the resources, labor, and culinary expertise the household commands. The aesthetic principle at work is known as 3 chop, 5 sang, 7 surin, 9 jial, a classical formula prescribing 3 cold dishes, 5 hot dishes, 7 kinds of seasonings, and 9 delicacies for formal banquets. Some royal and aristocratic feasts expanded this to include literally hundreds of dishes, most of which would barely be tasted before being removed and replaced. This brings us to a crucial aspect of wealthy dining: conspicuous waste. The true signifier of extreme wealth isn't just consuming expensive foods, but having so much that you can afford to leave most of it untouched. Elite banquets feature elaborate dishes constructed purely for visual impact, dishes served and removed without being eaten, and quantities that deliberately exceed what guests could possibly consume. This practice would be morally incomprehensible to the average Korean farmer, for whom food waste was both economic disaster and ethical transgression. The physical environment of elite dining further reinforces status distinctions. While commoners eat from simple earthenware bowls, the wealthy dine using celadon, porcelain, and metal vessels, materials that transform the same foods into elevated experiences. The famous celadon of the Goryeo period, with its distinctive pale blue-green glaze, creates an almost otherworldly dining aesthetic where foods appear to float in translucent jade pools. By the Joseon period, white porcelain becomes the preferred material for elite tables. Its pristine surface, both practically showcasing food colors and symbolically emphasizing purity. Dining etiquette becomes another barrier separating elite from common eating. The wealthy don't just consume different foods, they eat differently, following elaborate protocols governing everything from seating arrangements to the proper angle for holding metal chopsticks. Yes, metal, not wooden like the commoners use. These dining rules aren't merely fussy formalities, but create embodied performances of status that become second nature to those raised in privilege, while remaining awkwardly foreign to social climbers. Seasonal eating takes on particular significance in elite food culture, while peasants are fundamentally seasonal eaters by economic necessity. The wealthy transform seasonality into aesthetic principle, celebrating the first harvest of prized ingredients, or consuming carefully preserved delicacies outside their natural season as demonstrations of connoisseurship. Eating the first matsutake mushrooms of autumn or the last persimmons preserved from the previous fall becomes a calendar-marking ritual among the elite. The actual content of the aristocratic diet differs markedly from common fare. While peasant protein comes primarily from fermented soybean products and tiny amounts of dried fish, wealthy tables feature substantial quantities of meat, beef, pork, game, and various types of seafood. Beef, in particular, becomes a status food, with specific cuts and preparation methods developing into highly specialized culinary traditions. The wealthy don't just eat more meat, they eat different parts, prepared with techniques requiring specialized equipment and trained cooks. Speaking of specialized preparation, the elite kitchen itself becomes a significant wealth marker. While commoners cook over a single fire, wealthy households maintain multiple kitchen buildings with specialized staff and equipment for different types of preparation. The royal kitchen of the Joseon dynasty featured numerous separate facilities and a staff of hundreds, a culinary infrastructure completely detached from the simple act of feeding people. Beverages deserve special mention in our catalog of consumable wealth. While common Koreans might drink barley tea or crude rice wine, the elite develop elaborate drinking cultures around refined alcoholic beverages. The most prestigious is perhaps myeongyakju, a clear rice wine requiring multiple fermentations and filtrations, resulting in a pure, subtle flavor that commoners would find disappointingly weak compared to their more robust homebrew. Non-alcoholic options include rare teas, some so precious that elaborate ceremony surrounds their preparation and consumption. The timing and structure of meals further distinguishes elite from common eating habits, while agricultural workers necessarily organize their eating around daylight and labor demands. The wealthy eat according to ritualized schedules, divorced from physical necessity. Multiple small meals, rather than fewer large ones, become standard practice, a pattern possible only with dedicated kitchen staff continuously preparing food throughout the day. The social dimension of elite dining cannot be overstated. While commoners generally eat with immediate family members, aristocratic meals function as political and social forums where alliances are formed, marriages arranged, and status hierarchies reinforced. The invitation to dine becomes a form of social currency. To be included or excluded from certain tables carries significant implications for one's position. The Yongbin dining room isn't just a place to consume calories, but a stage where social relationships are performed and negotiated. Particularly fascinating is how elite Korean food culture balances competing aesthetic principles borrowed from Confucianism, Buddhism, and indigenous traditions. Confucian values emphasize moderation and proper form, creating tension with displays of abundance. Buddhist influence introduced vegetarian temple cuisine, elevating plant foods through elaborate preparation methods that transform humble ingredients into luxury experiences. These philosophical crosscurrents create a uniquely Korean approach to elite dining that prizes refinement over mere quantity. Geographic diversity of the elite table also demonstrates wealth. While peasant meals primarily feature locally available ingredients, aristocratic dining incorporates regional specialties from across the peninsula and imported luxuries from China and beyond. A single meal might showcase mountain herbs from the northern provinces, seafood from the southern coast, and spices arrived via Chinese trade networks, a literal mapping of far-flung resources onto the intimate space of the dining table. By late Joseon, as merchant wealth increases and some sumptuary restrictions relax, food becomes a particularly important wealth battleground. Unable to openly display their prosperity through clothing or housing due to legal restrictions, wealthy merchants pour resources into increasingly elaborate private feasts, creating pressure for Yongbin families to maintain culinary supremacy as a key status marker. The result is an escalating culinary arms race where increasingly refined and resource-intensive dishes emerge as the ultimate expressions of unassailable status. Perhaps most telling is how hunger itself becomes aestheticized in elite food culture. The concept of midam, literally beautiful taste, emerges as a guiding principle that prizes subtlety, restraint, and the ability to appreciate delicate flavors. This aesthetic directly contradicts the biological imperative for caloric density that would naturally guide those who have experienced actual hunger. Only those so removed from food insecurity that they've never known genuine hunger could develop a cuisine that deliberately celebrates the barely there flavor of pine needle tea or the fleeting sweetness of carefully steamed rice cakes. In Joseon, Korea, would be surrounded by material treasures, gold, jewels, elaborate tapestries. And while these things certainly existed, the most precious possessions in elite households weren't shiny baubles, but bound volumes and carefully preserved scrolls. Imagine entering the sarangbang, the male receiving room of an elite Yongbin household around 1650. The room appears deceptively austere at first glance, with clean lines and minimal furnishings, but your educated eye would quickly spot the true treasures. The lacquered bookshelves containing row upon row of thread-bound volumes, the storage chests likely filled with scrolls and manuscripts, the carefully selected scholarly implements arranged on low writing tables. This is a physical manifestation of intellectual capital, a library that represents not just monetary value, but generations of accumulated knowledge. The core of any respectable Yongbin library consists of the Confucian classics, the 4 books, and 5 classics that form the foundation of civil service examination preparation. These aren't just texts. They're the intellectual DNA of the elite class, works so thoroughly internalized through years of memorization that they shape how the Yongbin perceive reality itself. Owning fine editions of these works is expected, but the truly wealthy invest in rare commentaries, obscure philosophical treatises, and specialized texts that demonstrate intellectual breadth beyond mere examination preparation. What makes these collections particularly valuable isn't just their content, but their material form. The finest books are printed using carved wooden blocks, or for the most prestigious works, movable metal type, a technology Goryeo pioneered generations before Gutenberg. The paper itself represents significant investment made from mulberry bark through labor-intensive processes that yield durable, insect-resistant pages. Bindings use specialized stitching techniques and protective covers that allow these volumes to survive centuries with proper care, making books literal intergenerational investments. For the most precious texts, copying becomes an art form in itself. Skilled calligraphers, often the Yongbin themselves, as beautiful handwriting is considered essential to scholarly identity, create manuscript copies of rare works, sometimes producing volumes so aesthetically perfect they surpass printed editions in value. These aren't merely functional reproductions, but artistic creations where the physical form becomes inseparable from the intellectual content. What's particularly fascinating about these collections is their economic peculiarity. Unlike most luxury goods, books are simultaneously consumable and durable. You extract value through reading, while the physical object retains or even increases in worth over time. They're also remarkably difficult for the uninitiated to evaluate properly. Any wealthy merchant might recognize a gold bracelet's value, but understanding why one seemingly similar volume might be worth 10 or 100 times more than another requires specialized knowledge available only to the already educated, creating a closed system of value that reinforces class boundaries. Beyond books, calligraphy emerges as perhaps the single most important art form for displaying cultural capital. The ability to write with both technical perfection and artistic flair becomes the ultimate status skill, more important than martial prowess, political cunning, or business acumen. Elite men spend thousands of hours mastering brush techniques, studying the work of ancient masters, and developing personal styles that balance convention and individuality. The resulting works aren't merely decorative, but function as intellectual pedigrees, physical proof of the creator's education, taste, and cultural lineage. The most prestigious form of calligraphic display isn't flashy public monuments, but exchanged scrolls and albums, small-scale works shared between scholars as gifts or created during social gatherings. These intimate formats create networks of intellectual exchange, visible only to participants, excluding those without the education to appreciate both the technical execution and the literary content referenced. When a Yongbin gifts another with a personally brushed poem, he's not just sharing pretty characters, but demonstrating command of classical illusion, poetic convention, and physical technique, a multi-layered performance of status. Collections of these calligraphic works become another form of wealth, with particularly fine examples preserved in specialized storage chests designed to protect delicate paper from humidity and insects. The connoisseurship required to evaluate these works creates yet another barrier to entry for social climbers. You can't simply purchase taste. You must develop it through years of education and exposure. By the mid-Joseon period, the ability to recognize famous calligraphers' styles, evaluate the quality of brushwork, and understand the literary references contained in these works becomes a crucial social skill among the elite. Painting occupies a similar but slightly less prestigious position in the hierarchy of knowledge-based wealth. The most valued works aren't decorative landscapes for public display, but intimate album leaves and scrolls that combine image and text, often landscapes or scholarly themes executed in monochrome ink rather than colorful scenes. These works usually incorporate calligraphic elements with poems or prose inscriptions that complement the visual components. Again, the appreciation requires multi-layered literacy, understanding the technical execution, the art historical references, and the literary content simultaneously. For those lacking the resources to assemble significant original collections, reproduction becomes an acceptable alternative. Talented Yongbin might create albums of inspiration containing their own copies of famous works, not presented as originals, but as evidence of their study and appreciation. These copies serve as intellectual resumes, demonstrating both technical skill and familiarity with canonical works. The practice creates an interesting dynamic where copying, normally associated with counterfeit and deception in material goods, becomes a legitimate form of knowledge display when properly contextualized. The scholarly stationery used in creating these works, the four treasures of the study, emerges as another category of knowledge-based wealth. Brushes made from rare animal hairs, inkstones carved from prized stone, paper made through specialized processes, and ink produced from soot of particular woods or oils become connoisseurs' items collected and displayed with as much pride as the works they're used to create. The most valuable examples combine material rarity with historical provenance. Brushes said to have belonged to famous scholars, or inkstones passed down through generations of a prominent lineage. What's particularly interesting about knowledge as wealth is how it creates different consumption patterns from material luxury. Where typical status goods encourage conspicuous consumption, intellectual capital often promotes conspicuous production, demonstrating not just what you own, but what you can create. The ideal Yongbin doesn't just accumulate books, but composes poetry, writes philosophical treatises, and produces calligraphic works that might themselves become collectibles. This productively focused status system creates a strange meritocratic element within an otherwise rigid class structure. Genuine talent can't be entirely faked, even if access to the necessary education remains severely restricted. By the late Joseon period, private libraries become so central to elite identity that specialized buildings, the nijang or book house, become standard features of wealthy compounds. These structures are architectural manifestations of intellectual wealth, designed specifically for preserving and accessing text-based knowledge. The most sophisticated examples include features like raised floors to prevent moisture damage, specialized ventilation to control humidity, and architectural elements that maximize natural light for reading while minimizing direct sunlight that might damage books. The social rituals surrounding these knowledge collections further reinforce their status function. Scholarly gatherings where men compose poetry, practice calligraphy, and discuss philosophical texts become central elite activities, performances of intellectual capacity that simultaneously strengthen social bonds and exclude those lacking the necessary education. These aren't just pleasant social events, but competitive arenas where reputation and status are constantly negotiated through displays of knowledge. For ambitious families rising through the social ranks, investment in knowledge infrastructure becomes a necessary multi-generational strategy. A merchant family hoping to transition to Yongbin status might need to invest in 3 generations of sons, the first acquiring enough wealth to free the second from commercial activities to pursue full-time study, potentially allowing the third to pass the civil service examinations and secure official position. This extraordinarily patient approach to social mobility underscores just how seriously knowledge capital was taken as the foundation of true wealth. What makes this knowledge-based status system particularly fascinating is its persistence beyond material circumstances. Families might experience significant financial decline while maintaining social position through their intellectual capital, creating the curious phenomenon of the poor Yongbin, who possesses extensive education but limited material resources. These scholar officials might live in increasingly modest circumstances while still commanding social respect due to their knowledge, literary accomplishments, and family historical associations with intellectual achievement. Unlike material wealth, which can be exhausted through consumption, knowledge capital tends to compound over time, creating dynastic advantages that become nearly impossible for newcomers to overcome. Families with established scholarly traditions accumulate not just books and art, but teaching methodologies, insider knowledge about examination systems, and networks of relationships with other educated families, assets that can't be easily purchased or appropriated. Wars of history and examine how spiritual economics transformed definitions of wealth across centuries of Korean dynastic change. You're about to witness one of history's most fascinating religious inversions, how Buddhism, once the gilded darling of the Goryeo elite, became a liability under Neo-Confucian Joseon rule, fundamentally reshaping how the wealthy displayed piety and purchased their spiritual insurance policies. During the Goryeo period, from 918 to 1392, Buddhism wasn't just a state religion, it was the ultimate luxury brand. Imagine the equivalent of having Gucci, Prada, and Louis Vuitton combine into a single entity that simultaneously controlled your spiritual destiny, educational system, and significant portions of the national economy. That's Buddhism in Goryeo. The wealthy didn't just practice Buddhism, they invested in it massively, funding temple complexes larger than many towns, commissioning gold-inscribed sutras on indigo-dyed paper, and dedicating children to monastic orders as a form of spiritual and political networking. The most spectacular expressions of elite Buddhist patronage were the monumental publication projects, complete sets of the Buddhist canon carved onto tens of thousands of wooden printing blocks, requiring decades of concentrated labor and resources comparable to medieval Europe's grandest cathedrals. These weren't merely religious texts, but spiritual insurance policies carved in wood, merit-generating machines that simultaneously displayed the patron's wealth and supposedly guaranteed favorable rebirth. Elite Buddhist practice in Goryeo involved staggering financial commitments. Wealthy families routinely built private temples on their estates, funded elaborate ceremonies involving hundreds of monks, and commissioned custom sutras written in gold or silver ink on dyed paper, objects so precious they were artworks first and texts second. When you died, your family would commission posthumous ceremonies so lavish they might bankrupt lesser households. Multiple 7-day cycles of continuous chanting by teams of monks, construction of stupas or statues bearing your name, and distribution of alms on a scale meant to demonstrate both piety and prosperity. The physical landscape of Goryeo wealth reflected this Buddhist orientation. Elite compounds often included private shrines housing exquisite Buddhist sculptures, paintings, and ritual implements. The wealthiest families maintained their own temple lands, estates whose agricultural income supported specific monasteries, while conveniently avoiding royal taxation. These weren't modest contributions, but major financial arrangements that structured significant portions of the national economy. Then came the Joseon dynasty, founded in 1392 by coup leaders deeply influenced by Neo-Confucian ideology that viewed Buddhism as corrupt, excessive, and fundamentally contrary to proper social order. Suddenly, the spiritual currency that had powered elite identity for centuries experienced catastrophic devaluation. Those golden sutras and private temples, once the height of elite display, became embarrassing liabilities, markers of outdated sensibilities and questionable loyalties. The wealthy adapted with remarkable speed, rapidly transferring their spiritual investments to Neo-Confucian alternatives. Private Buddhist shrines were replaced with ancestral halls dedicated to rigorous Confucian ritual. Lavish donations to temples gave way to funding for Confucian academies. Instead of commissioning elaborate sutras, elites now invested in publishing scholarly editions of Confucian classics and histories. The forms of display changed, but the fundamental principle remained. Spiritual capital required substantial material investment. The ancestral shrine, Jongmyo, or Sadeng, became the centerpiece of this new spiritual economy. These structures, housing memorial tablets for deceased family members, required regular ritual observances according to precisely codified procedures. The proper performance of these ceremonies demanded specialized knowledge, specific ritual implements, and considerable expenditure on food offerings. A comprehensive package of material and intellectual resources available only to the truly wealthy. These ancestral rites weren't merely private devotions, but public performances of status. The scale and precision of a family's ancestral ceremonies communicated their position in both spiritual and social hierarchies. A wealthy family might maintain an ancestral shrine for up to 4 generations of patrilineal ancestors. The 4 shrines system, with each generational level requiring its own ritual space and ceremonial implements. The most prestigious households received royal permission to maintain shrines beyond this limit, creating visible distinctions in how families could honor their dead. The material culture surrounding these rituals became increasingly elaborate over the Joseon period. Specialized ceramic and wooden vessels, many produced exclusively for ritual use, filled the storerooms of wealthy households. Texts detailing proper ceremonial procedures occupied prominent places in family libraries. Dedicated buildings for preparation and storage of ritual implements became standard features of elite compounds. This entire material infrastructure represented substantial investment that distinguished proper Yongbin practice from the more modest ancestral rites observed by commoners. What's particularly fascinating about this spiritual transition is how it reframed the relationship between wealth and religious practice. Where Goryeo Buddhism had offered mechanisms for the conspicuous display of surplus wealth through donation and patronage, Joseon Neo-Confucianism emphasized moderation and restraint, at least in theory. In practice, the wealthy simply redirected their display impulses into ever more elaborate versions of supposedly modest Confucian rituals, creating a curious dynamic where ostentatious simplicity became its own form of luxury consumption. The management of death rituals provides perhaps the clearest example of how spiritual economics reshaped elite practice. Where Buddhist funeral practices had emphasized elaborate ceremonies aimed at generating merit for favorable rebirth, Confucian funerals focused on precise performance of rituals, establishing proper relationships between living and dead. The elaborate mourning costume worn by eldest sons, uncomfortable garments of coarse hemp worn for 3 full years, became a visible marker of both filial piety and the financial ability to withdraw from productive activity for extended periods. Only the truly wealthy could afford to have sons essentially cease economic contribution for 3 years, transforming mourning itself into a class privilege. Geomancy, Pungsu, represents another fascinating intersection of spiritual and material wealth in Korean elite practice. This system of divination focused on identifying auspicious locations for graves, homes, and other structures, became increasingly sophisticated during the Joseon period. Wealthy families employed specialized geomantic practitioners to identify optimal burial sites believed to to channel favorable energy to descendants. These locations often required expensive terrain modifications, construction of protective structures, and ongoing maintenance, creating another domain where spiritual benefit required material investment. The practice created remarkable landscapes of privilege, with the most auspicious mountain sites reserved for elite graves through a combination of financial resources and political connections. Some prominent lineages maintained burial grounds extending across entire hillsides, with graves positioned according to elaborate geomantic principles and periodic rituals, requiring descendants to travel specifically for ceremonial observances. The wealthy didn't just secure better accommodations for themselves in life, they occupied premium spiritual real estate in death. By the mid-Joseon period, we see fascinating hybrid practices emerging among the elite as Buddhism gradually recovers limited acceptance. Some wealthy families maintain seemingly perfect Confucian observance in public, while quietly patronizing Buddhist temples for supplementary spiritual protection, a kind of diversified afterlife investment portfolio. Women of elite households often become particularly important in maintaining these Buddhist connections, creating gendered spiritual economies where men perform public Confucian rituals while women manage more private Buddhist practices. The religious landscape becomes further complicated by the rising influence of folk religious practices, and later, the arrival of Catholicism and Protestantism. Each introduces new forms of spiritual capital with different relationships to material wealth. Folk religious specialists like Mudang, shamans, occupy ambiguous positions, officially discouraged by Confucian orthodoxy, but practically engaged even by elite households seeking supplementary spiritual assistance. Their rituals frequently involve substantial material components, from specific foods to paper offerings, creating yet another domain where proper spiritual practice requires financial expenditure. What makes this spiritual economy particularly interesting is how it creates different relationships to wealth across time. Buddhism's merit-making mechanisms allowed for direct conversion of material surplus into spiritual benefit. The wealthy could essentially purchase better karmic outcomes through donation and patronage. The Neo-Confucian system theoretically rejected this transactional approach, but in practice created its own economy of ritual observance, where proper performance required substantial resources. In both systems, spiritual and material capital remained fundamentally intertwined, with the specific mechanisms simply shifting to reflect dominant ideologies. By the late Joseon period, elite spiritual practice becomes remarkably complex, a carefully calibrated balance of public Confucian orthodoxy, private Buddhist patronage, selective engagement with folk practices, and increasingly cautious interest in Western religions among certain progressive families. This spiritual portfolio management represents a sophisticated approach to metaphysical risk distribution, with families maintaining multiple channels of otherworldly connection as insurance against uncertain afterlife outcomes. And step into the realm of secondary wives and domestic power networks. You're about to discover how elite Korean households functioned as complex political ecosystems where women, officially subordinate in a rigidly patriarchal system, wielded extraordinary influence through elaborate relationship structures that modern organizational charts would struggle to capture. The family structure of wealthy households in both Goryeo and Joseon periods extended far beyond the simple nuclear unit familiar to modern observers. While the primary wife, the chiabu, occupied the official position of household matriarch, elite men routinely maintained multiple sexual and reproductive relationships with secondary wives or concubines, chiab. These arrangements weren't clandestine affairs, but formally recognized relationships with specific legal statuses, inheritance implications, and social expectations. For wealthy Yongbin men, maintaining multiple wives wasn't simply about sexual privilege, it was a social obligation tied to lineage perpetuation and alliance building. In a society where male heirs were essential for maintaining family status and performing ancestral rites, the inability to produce sons represented existential threat to family continuity. Secondary wives provided reproductive insurance in an era of high infant mortality, while simultaneously creating connections to other families that could prove politically or economically advantageous. The material cost of maintaining these extended household structures was extraordinary. Each secondary wife required appropriate living quarters, servants, clothing, and allowances proportional to her status. Their children, particularly sons, needed education, eventual marriages, and often separate households established upon reaching adulthood. The capacity to support this expanded family ecosystem became its own wealth marker, with the most prominent officials sometimes maintaining household complexes resembling small villages rather than simple family residences. What makes these arrangements particularly fascinating is how they transformed the interior geography of elite compounds into political territories with their own borders, alliances, and conflicts. The primary wife typically controlled the anki, the inner women's quarters, while secondary wives occupied separate buildings within the larger compound. These physical divisions created distinct zones of influence where different women established bases of power through control over resources, information, and access to the male household head. The relationships between these women defied simple hierarchical models, while Confucian principles established clear status distinctions, with primary wives outranking all secondary partners. Practical power dynamics often depended on factors like which woman bore sons, particularly the crucial first son, who maintained stronger emotional connections with the male head, who possessed valuable skills or knowledge, and who cultivated superior political networks extending beyond household boundaries. Children became central to these complex power negotiations. Sons, especially firstborn sons, represented the ultimate household currency, guaranteeing their mother's position regardless of her formal status. A secondary wife who produced the first son, while the primary wife remained childless, might functionally outrank her superior in practical household influence. These relationships created situations where formal hierarchy and actual power operated along entirely different axes, with everyone involved engaging in sophisticated political calculations that would impress Machiavelli. The material culture surrounding these relationships reveals their economic and social significance. Gift exchanges between husbands and multiple wives, particularly clothing, jewelry, and household goods, established visual hierarchies of favor visible to everyone in the compound. The quality and quantity of these gifts communicated precise gradations of status and preference that modified official positions. A secondary wife, receiving finer silks than the primary wife, sent unmistakable signals about household power dynamics that everyone from servants to family members immediately registered. Education becomes another fascinating dimension of this extended household economy. In wealthy families, the sons of both primary and secondary wives typically received comparable scholarly training, creating a cohort of half-brothers who might later compete for bureaucratic positions and family leadership. The daughters, meanwhile, received education appropriate to their mother's status and marriage prospects, creating different levels of cultural capital within the same generation of siblings. The economic impact of these arrangements extended well beyond the immediate household. Marriage connections, established through daughters of various wives, created complex webs of kinship that functioned as business networks, political alliances, and social safety nets. These relationship structures often spanned generations, with descendants of secondary wives maintaining connections to the main family line while simultaneously establishing their own branch lineages. The result was an ever-expanding network of relatives with varying degrees of obligation to each other, a kinship system so intricate it required specialized genealogical records to track properly. Perhaps most interesting is how these expanded family structures created intergenerational wealth strategies impossible within simple nuclear families. The sons of secondary wives often served as financial or political agents for the main family line, pursuing commercial ventures or risky political alignments that mainline heirs couldn't afford to associate with directly. These branch family members provided strategic flexibility. They could engage in activities technically beneath Yangban dignity while maintaining family connections that ensured profits or influence flowed back to the main line. This arrangement becomes particularly important during political upheavals, when factional conflicts led to purges of officials associated with losing political alignments. Families with diverse marriage connections through multiple wives often managed to maintain footholds in opposing camps, creating remarkable resilience against political misfortune. A primary wife's relatives might suffer exile, while a secondary wife's connections provided safe haven and continued access to patronage networks. The inheritance practices surrounding these expanded families created fascinating economic structures. While primary wife sons typically inherited the main family estate and ancestral responsibilities, secondary wife sons often received substantial settlements, establishing separate branch households. These arrangements created clusters of related households that functioned as informal economic confederations, sharing resources, coordinating political strategies, and collectively enhancing family prosperity across multiple lineages. Domestic servants form another essential component of this expanded household economy. Wealthy compounds employ dozens or even hundreds of servants with varying statuses, from chattel slaves to skilled household managers, occupying positions of significant responsibility and relative privilege. These weren't simply workers, but extensions of the family's status display, their numbers, appearance, and behavior directly reflecting on household prestige. The relationship between secondary wives and household servants created particularly complex power dynamics, with some trusted servants wielding greater practical influence than lower status family members. The sexual politics underlying these arrangements deserve particular attention. While secondary wives were officially recognized partners rather than temporary consorts, their fundamental value remained inextricably linked to reproductive capacity and sexual access, creating inherently exploitative power dynamics regardless of material comfort provided. The system simultaneously offered certain women access to wealth and status impossible in commoner marriages, while subjecting them to fundamental restrictions on autonomy and dignity, foreign to lower-class unions, where husband and wife typically worked as practical economic partners. By the late Joseon period, we see fascinating shifts in these household politics as Neo-Confucian orthodoxy increasingly emphasized the primary wife's authority, while practical considerations still necessitated expanded reproductive strategies. Some wealthy households develop elaborate fictions, maintaining theoretical adherence to monogamous ideals, while practically operating extended reproductive networks, such as officially adopting sons born to secondary wives as if they were children of the primary union. These arrangements create paper genealogies that satisfy orthodoxy, while practical household arrangements continue to reflect multi-partner reality. As we approach the modern period, new economic pressures transform these traditional arrangements. The declining fortunes of many Yongbin families reduce their ability to maintain multiple wives in appropriate style, while rising merchant wealth creates new categories of multi-partner households without traditional status restrictions. By the late 19th century, emerging modernized elites begin adopting Western-influenced monogamous marriage patterns as markers of progressive values, creating yet another transformation in how wealth displays itself through family structure. What makes the entire concubinage system particularly fascinating is how it created a paradoxical space where women, officially subordinate in a rigidly patriarchal ideology, exercised remarkable agency through network building, strategic alliance formation, and skilled manipulation of household politics. The secondary wife, with strong family connections, economic skills, or political acumen, could accumulate influence far exceeding her formal position, demonstrating how even highly restrictive social systems contain internal contradictions that creative individuals exploit to expand their practical autonomy. We've been drifting down together has now carried us to the twilight of the Joseon dynasty, that final, faltering breath of a 500-year-old regime. You're witnessing wealth transform before your eyes as Western influences seep into Korea and traditional markers of status begin to crumble like forgotten ancestral tablets. The night around us grows deeper as our story nears its conclusion, but the historical drama intensifies. Remember those sumptuous hanbok and those exquisite celadon vases we lingered over hours ago. Remember the Yongbin who wouldn't be caught dead performing manual labor. Watch closely now as their world dissolves into something unrecognizable. By the late 19th century, the Hermit Kingdom can no longer keep the outside world at bay. Foreign powers circle Korea like hungry wolves. Russia, China, Japan, and Western nations, all wanting their piece. The once mighty Joseon, weakened by internal corruption and factional infighting that we explored back in Section 6, stumbles toward modernization with all the grace of a drunken nobleman trying to navigate his courtyard after a particularly enthusiastic wine ceremony. The 1876 Treaty of Ganghwa with Japan cracked open the door, and subsequent agreements with Western powers flung it wide. Suddenly, Korean merchants and elites find themselves confronted with curious new commodities, pocket watches that tick with mysterious precision, spectacles that correct failing vision, umbrellas that don't leak, and cameras that capture perfect likenesses without the need for a painter's flattery. And you, dear listener, might think this merely represents the normal evolution of consumer goods, but in Joseon Korea, it upends the entire conception of wealth. For the first time in centuries, money, raw, vulgar currency, begins to matter more than bloodlines. The nouveau rich merchants who'd been accumulating wealth while the Yongbin weren't looking suddenly have access to goods that even the most ancient noble families cannot obtain through traditional channels. You can almost hear the collective gasp of horror from aristocratic households across the peninsula. My third cousin twice removed might be the royal court's undersecretary for ceremonial bowing techniques, but that fish merchant's son has a German-made pocket watch and Western leather shoes. A Yongbin might lament, while secretly wondering how to get his hands on similar treasures without appearing to have stooped to commerce. The royal court itself begins adopting Western artifacts as status symbols. King Gajang, that unfortunate monarch who would preside over Korea's final loss of independence, develops quite the fondness for foreign technologies. Electric lights illuminate the palace in 1887 years, before most Western royals enjoyed such luxuries. Telephones connect the royal quarters. A modern waterworks system ensures clean water flows in the palace. These technological wonders become the new markers of ultimate privilege, reserved first for royalty, then gradually filtering down to the wealthy elites who can afford them. Women's wealth signifiers change too. The traditional janget, that modesty cloak we discussed, that wealthy women used to cover themselves when venturing outside, gradually gives way to parasols imported from Japan or the West. No longer is a woman's status measured by how completely she can disappear from public view, but paradoxically by her possession of these new, visible foreign goods. By the 1890s, the most fashionable Korean gentlemen have begun to experiment with Western suits, at least for certain occasions. Imagine the cultural earthquake. This represents centuries of strict sumptuary laws dictating clothing based on social rank, suddenly confronted with a completely foreign aesthetic that ignores traditional hierarchies. The top hat replaces the gat for some forward-thinking or collaborationist elites. The Western-style mustache challenges the traditional Korean full beard as the mark of a distinguished gentleman. You might be lying in bed thinking this sounds like simple fashion evolution, but remember, in Joseon Korea, appearance was policy, regulated by the state. These changes represent nothing less than the collapse of a visual system that had maintained social control for centuries. And then comes 1910, and with it, the final indignity: Japanese colonial rule. Japanese occupation brings with it a particularly cruel twist for Korea's traditional elite. While the colonial authorities need Korean collaborators to help administer their new possession, they systematically dismantle the Yongbin as a class. Land surveys and property reforms strip many old families of their ancestral holdings. The Japanese education system, mandatory for advancement in colonial society, teaches Japanese language and customs while deliberately suppressing Korean traditions. Wealth in colonial Korea takes on new dimensions. The truly wealthy are now those who can navigate two worlds, maintaining connections to Japanese power while preserving enough Korean identity to operate within indigenous social networks. Some former Yongbin families manage this transformation, converting their Confucian education and social connections into positions within the colonial bureaucracy or emerging industrial concerns. Others sink into genteel poverty, clinging to ancestral tablets and heirlooms. While the world changes around them, you'd recognize the newly rich of 1930s Korea by their hybrid lifestyles. Japanese architectural elements incorporated into Korean-style homes, wardrobes containing both traditional hanbok and Western or Japanese attire, children studying at prestigious Japanese schools, while ancestral rites are still performed at home. The wealthiest might own automobiles, unimaginable luxury, in a society where, just decades earlier, even the highest officials traveled by palanquin or horseback. Land ownership remains important, but now it's increasingly about commercial value rather than ancestral connection. The old Yongbin ideal of gentleman scholar has given way to the modern businessman, the government official, or the professional with foreign education. Technical knowledge trumps classical learning. The man who can speak Japanese fluently and understand modern banking practices enjoys more practical power than the one who can recite Confucian classics from memory. For Korean women from wealthy families, this period brings particularly disorienting changes. The strictures of traditional seclusion gradually loosen, not through indigenous reform, but through external pressure. Girls from elite families increasingly receive education, though primarily to make them wise mothers who can raise sons suitable for the modern world. Some privileged women even study abroad, returning with bobbed hair, Western clothes, and ideas about women's rights that would have been unthinkable in traditional Joseon society. The material trappings of wealth diversify dramatically during this period. The traditional tile-roofed hanok, with its elegant simplicity, competes with Western-influenced architecture, featuring conspicuous parlors designed to display imported furniture. Celadon vases might now share shelf space with German clocks and English bone china. The wealthy home might contain both a traditional Korean kitchen and a Western-style dining room. Status anxiety manifests in consuming the right foreign goods while maintaining appropriate Korean elements, a balancing act requiring considerable cultural sophistication. Throughout the colonial period, displays of Korean cultural heritage take on new significance. For collaborationist elites, maintaining traditional customs alongside adopted Japanese practices demonstrates their cultural flexibility and sophistication. For wealthy families engaged in quiet resistance, preserving Korean arts, pursuing traditional scholarship, and patronizing Korean craftspeople becomes a form of patriotic defiance. Wealth now buys the privilege of deciding how much of one's Korean identity to preserve or subordinate. By the 1940s, as our story approaches its end, wealth in Korea has become nearly unrecognizable from what it was when we began our tale. The material goods, the education, the social connections that signify elite status have transformed radically. The colonial experience forces Koreans to reconsider what parts of their traditional culture to preserve and what to discard in the face of modernization imposed from outside. And yet, as you drift closer to sleep, consider this continuity. Through all these transformations, certain fundamentals endure. Family connections still matter enormously. Education, though its content has changed, remains a crucial pathway to advancement. The obligation to care for ancestors through ritual observance persists even among the most westernized elites. The wealthy still seek to display their status, though the acceptable means of doing so have transformed. In this way, Korean wealth reveals something universal about human societies. Our status markers may change their outward form, but the underlying social impulses remain remarkably consistent. The Yongbin scholar with his rice fields and his white robes is not so different from the colonial-era businessman in his Western suit with his modern factory. Both seek security, respect, and the ability to pass advantage to their children. We've traveled from the Buddhist-influenced Goryeo elites with their Celadon treasures and their golden-lettered sutras through the Neo-Confucian transformation that reshaped what it meant to be wealthy, to the final twilight years when foreign influences forever altered Korea's traditional status markers. The scholars in their pristine white robes, the noble women hidden behind screens in inner courtyards, the merchants gradually rising to prominence despite official disdain. All these figures recede now into the comfortable darkness of historical memory. Let them fade gently, their stories complete for tonight. The weight of ancestry, the burden of ritual propriety, the endless striving for status that defined wealth in these Korean dynasties. Allow all of it to dissolve as you sink deeper into restfulness. The strict hierarchies and sumptuary laws no longer constrain you. The complex social codes need no more deciphering tonight. As your breathing slows and your thoughts grow quieter, know that these centuries of Korean history will wait patiently for your return, should you wish to visit them again on another sleepless night. But for now, release them completely and let yourself drift away into the welcoming embrace of sleep.